Good afternoon. From the organization of the European Conference on Architecture and the Media, I welcome you to the third day of talks and debates. We are now halfway through our program, and I must say we feel very grateful for all the nice messages we have received from journalists, architectural professionals, photographers, and filmmakers from different places in the world. All these positive feedbacks and supports reward and rejoice us. Thank you very much. And for this result, I want to especially thank the work of the Fundación Mies van der Rohe, my Labo team, our streaming partner Linka, the media partners who helped us to reach more audience, and the last but most important, all the speakers that enthusiastically accept to be part of this must-be event dedicated to the dissemination of architecture into the media. Thank you. And now, Ivan Blasi, curator of prizes and programs of the Fundación Mies van der Rohe, will introduce the next debate. I give him the floor from his truly privileged location.
Thank you very much, Miriam. In fact, I just came back from the dentist, and he asked me where I work, and so I told him, well, here. And he said, oh, there was this controversy, this polemic now recently. And I was thinking, wow, if it has to do with architecture and you've heard about it, it's probably about corruption or some kind of scandal, because that's what we hear about architecture normally on the news, on TV and radio. He goes on and he says, yeah, it was regarding the authorship. If it was Mies van der Rohe or if it was a woman or something. And I told him, yeah, there was Lily Reich and Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, who were partners at that time, and they were the ones together in charge of building all the German part of the Barcelona exhibition in 1929. And I asked him, where did you hear this? And he said, oh, it was a radio program in which they were speaking about gender equality. And I was in the morning preparing here the place for my patients and so on. And I always have the radio on. And then I remembered, and this was it was perfect so I could explain it right now. But then I remembered also that a year ago I was in the United States with a friend in Texas. And there I realized how big distances are between one place and the other, and how much they use the car and they need the car. And this friend, who I think he might, Marcel, he might be following us right now, he was telling me, well, here we have to use the car to go everywhere, and distances are huge. There's a lot of traffic jams. And so everybody listens to radio, and everybody also, or many, many, many people listen to podcasts. And so I thought, oh, it's true. I didn't listen to so many podcasts. So probably the way radio and podcasts are followed in other places of the world has to do also with specific context. So I think it's really interesting that after learning more about the audiovisual production yesterday and how it is used to disseminate architecture, its means, but also how architects use these audiovisual products as tools to work with in their own projects, today we will focus on radio, podcast channels, and new trends. And to do so, we are really lucky to count with Josep Blázquez, who has this program, a digital program called Perspectiva, Perspective, on Catalunya Ràdio, and the headquarters are here in Barcelona. We also count with Rūta Leitanaitė, who is an architect who is also the leader of the program on radio called Need an Architect. Both programs are focused on audiences. And also we have Iñigo Picabea, who runs El Ojo Crítico, the critical eye, on the national Spanish radio, also in this case with the headquarters in Madrid. And then we also have Andrew Tuck, who runs the Urbanist, which is this podcast by Monocle or for Monocle in London. So, and in this case, well, we will see how they focus on different audiences and, well, the achievements that they have had so far. Rūta, we have invited you to moderate this conversation, but we're also very interested in your own points of view and your own experiences with your program and so on. So at the same time, we're asking you nearly two things to kind of ask our guests, but also to know more about you and yourself. So I thank you all for being with us today, and let's begin. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ivan. Hello and welcome to the Roundtable of a Rare Species, host of radio programs about architecture. I'm very glad to have here with me such a distinguished company of Iñigo, Josep, Lluís, and last but definitely not least, Andrew. As Ivan's introduction had left with nothing to add for a perfect start, we will shoot directly the questions. And the first of them is, there are quite a few radio programs on various arts. There are quite a few TV programs on architecture, but a radio program or a section of a cultural program or a podcast dedicated to architecture is a rarity. Why, in your opinion? And I would like to start directing this question to Josep Lluís, as he's got the longest experience on radio.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm not sure if I've got the longest experience. Anyway, usually the architecture is considered a very complicated thing, and sometimes it even causes some kind of fear to the communicators themselves. It seems that we couldn't be able to speak about the architecture in a relaxed mode, especially when we are not architects, so such as my particular case. But in addition, the architects themselves are commonly considered rare people. So I think that it's not exact to say that the architect is a rare thing, in my opinion. Maybe we will better say that the architects are rare, or at least they used to speak very rare. So there is an addition of different aspects that create the fear of talking about architecture, I think. But anyways, I must say that my program is fully dedicated to the architecture. It has absolutely no sense without the architecture. And of course, we often talk about art, technology, philosophy, ecology, and much more, but only when all the subjects are directly related to the architecture, never in any other case. And it seems even more comfortable for me because it gives me a very clear limit. I love art, I love philosophy, I love technology, but when I place this boundary, it's very easy for me to find the exact goal of my chronicles without effort. It comes given to me by a natural way. And I have to say that one of my first programs of architecture, I was feeling myself scared, yes, but it was a very brief feeling because I rapidly discovered that the architects, maybe they are rare people, maybe yes, but they are also amazing people, sometimes not from this planet even. And that's great, it's fantastic. And I feel myself very lucky of having the chance to talk about those things and try to make it understandable to the rest of the people that is not an architect or did not study architecture in the university, or they not come from a family of architects, nor any other thing on his life that could approach them to the architect language. I love it.
Iñigo, why there are not that many radio programs on architecture, in your opinion?
But maybe because it's like a very niche story, niche content. It's for architects and maybe people interested among the broader broader public, but maybe because they see it as a very technical issue. I agree with Josep Lluís that sometimes it's maybe scary to talk about very technical issues, and at the same time, that's our challenge. I mean, to try to explain these technical issues and to be more clear, and maybe connecting these architecture issues to people's life, because at the end, architecture is in everyday life, in our workplaces, houses. We've seen now with this crisis how important is our home to stay in. And so it's true that people, it's I think it's something to do with that technical issue that makes difficult, because maybe they don't see architecture as a culture issue, for example. But that's challenging, and that's nice to be challenging. Just a clarification: I don't run that program, El Ojo Crítico. I participate in that program, which is a program of a lot of fields about culture, and sometimes we open way to speak about architecture. But it's true that it's not the main field of culture among all the culture news that appear and that are broadcasted on radio.
Andrew, and you were so brave as to dive into that raw technical world of architecture. Why? Did you see some lack of such kind of programs, or was there any other reasons? And would you agree that there are too few radio programs about architecture?
Well, our starting point was we felt there were amazing conversations going on in the academic world, at conferences, in city halls, at the convening of mayors' conventions. But often the conversation there was in a narrow group of people who spoke a kind of language that made it a bit of a mystery to outsiders exactly what they were talking about. They didn't talk about green space or parks. It was always public realm. But the ordinary people know what that means, and they're having the same conversations. They know what they want from their city. They know what they want from their built environment. So we tried to make the show a little bit of a go-between between all the debates that are happening at a community level. All of us, we walk out into our cities and we know that people care about public transport, places to sit, the scale of buildings, the density of buildings. And I think, as everyone has just been saying, especially now, if you can explain to people good architecture can help define the outcomes in healthcare, good architecture can change the kind of education that your children get at school. Good education is about how you feel safe and secure in your house, even if you're told to stay there for weeks. So if we can get everybody talking about the same things, it's a very rich conversation. So that's why we started. And I think the same thing, it's this problem that on one side, architecture is a technical skill, and it is a very complicated discipline. And sometimes in the past, there have been architects who didn't feel they needed to explain their work, that their work was there to be appreciated, and they were making the statement. They were artists almost. That's a very small group of people. The majority of architects in the middle, they want to have that discussion. They want to be part of a city debate. So it's just trying to make sure that you put things in easy language. And lastly, my job as a presenter is I don't have to worry about knowing the technical stuff. I have to know how to almost ask the stupid question. Tell me, what do you do? Tell me, explain to me. And if I can get people to give very simple answers, then you're in a good place because everybody understands.
I think that, yes, the problem lies in the understanding what is architecture and what is not. The wide public understands that architecture is just, brick and concrete and all those technical drawings, but there is a huge field behind the architecture and a lot of things related to the architecture, lots of stories related with the architecture that are not being told. And probably this is the reason why there are not that many people talking about architecture on the radio. I remember my first meeting with the editor of that media that I work for, and she asked me, how are you going to talk about architecture if you can't show it? And that leads me to another question, which is, compared with other broadcasting media like TV, but also the magazines and digital platforms we all share, working on the radio sector, we challenge of explaining architecture without images. Did you live any situations where you felt it was especially complicated? Andrew, we started with you.
Not really. That's why I love radio. Radio tells different kinds of stories and it lets people build pictures in their minds. Every week we have a separate tiny show called Tall Stories. It's literally 5 minutes. One journalist talks about one building in the world, or one urban intervention in the world. And it's amazing that they're so wonderful to listen to, because the power of description on radio is incredible. It's so intimate. It's in your ear. You have this relationship to it. It lets you dream a little bit more. So I've never worried about the difficulty of that. The only difficulty I find is, as I hinted before, is sometimes when you go to conferences and you're speaking to people in their milieu, they're all together, getting them in those situations to be a bit more relaxed, to talk about projects and schemes and ideas in a more human way can sometimes be difficult. But just to come back to that thing you said, Rūta, in the end, every building, every project, it only comes alive when we go into it, when the public goes into it. So architecture without people is zero. It's a zero game. So that's why we all have a role, because it's when these two things come together that it becomes exciting.
Josep, Lluís, did you have any difficulties with explaining architecture on your radio program without showing it?
Difficulties? No, I don't feel difficulties. As I said before, maybe at the in my beginnings, because is an uncurrent language is in our lives. For example, the children in the school, they learn a main language, a second language, then they used to learn music. Then they used to learn philosophy, which is another language, in fact. But rarely we learn architecture at the school. So when we arrive, when we become adults, we don't have the habit to explain the world by an architectural manner. If you are not an architect, you must learn this language by yourself. So maybe at the beginnings it was a small problem for me, but only a small problem because I'm an art historian, and art historians we are a deeper connection with architects, so we understand this language very easily.
Iñigo?
Yeah, I was worried when I started talking on the radio about architecture, about knowing these technical terms and words. But suddenly I knew some architects that told me that don't be worried about that, because we ourselves, architects, some of us want to be more clear about how we explain our work. So don't be as obscure as sometimes we are. So your work is not to know all the technical and all sometimes curatorial work surrounding architecture, which sometimes is very obscure and very like a barrier. So I relaxed a lot because some architects told me, don't be worried about that. I mean, come with us in that effort to be more clear for people, because that's the job. And I mean, talking about architecture without images is a question that sometimes I've been told that how do you, for example, as well for contemporary art, how do you speak about contemporary art in radio? Well, at the end, it's not giving like a total description of a buildings. Maybe it's like underlying the highlights, giving a glimpse to the people of that building. But it's not like at the end you have like a time limit on radio, so you cannot make a big description, very detailed, but maybe share a glimpse of what's more important about that building and the story of that building.
And I truly had several difficult situations explaining the architecture when I had the architect at my program, and I would say that there are two cases of bad storytelling. One case is when there is a very nice set of very nice slogans and very nice set of beautiful photographies, but no story behind it, no reason why the architecture is like that. And another bad experience is when there is a story, but the architect can't transmit it into the words. So yeah, sometimes you lack the content, sometimes you lack the skill to talk about what's behind your architecture that you provide. And I think that this is the job of us, the hosts, to help the architect to talk and to select the architecture that is not worth to be on our radio program, even if it has a very nice set of beautiful photographies. So we will continue talking about how to talk on the radio about architecture, which is obviously a challenge. But architecture, as I said, is not only bricks and steel, that is buildings. It's the very broad milieu of forces that shape architecture. That is politics, economy, ecology, social issues, culture, even psychology. It's also all the processes related to the birth of architecture, starting with education and ending with the community's activism. In your stories and conversations, how much attention and time you pay to the invisible part of the architecture? And I would address this question firstly to Andrew, because I think that this is the biggest part of his radio program, as far as I am acquainted with the content that he provides.
Yeah, so I guess it's been a very special period the last few weeks. So we've talked about all sorts of things. We just did a great show about food and the city and how our need for food shapes the environments we're in and how that's happened over time. An amazing author, Caroline Steele, came on to talk about her book, Cytopia, which is about food production and the relationship of city and countryside. So this is an invisible thing. But for me, in the magazine as well, what's interesting is a good architecture story could be a current affairs story. It could be the building of a new embassy. It could be how a country is using its soft power to tell its story through diplomacy. It should be a business story. It should be about how the environments that are built make people's working days better, or can make them better. It's a cultural story where our lives are told in theatres and cinemas. It's a design story. As you said, it's about branding. It's about all sorts of things. So often a very good architecture story, when we discuss it at the magazine, the architecture, there's a design editor who sits in the magazine and say, I would like this in my pages. And in the end, you say, it's a current affairs story. Let's move it to the current affairs section and a news page. So it's always a very good architecture story. Probably touches on all those things. It's going to change the city. It's going to change the community. It's going to be social. It's going to be psychological. It's going to be a thing of aesthetics and a thing of technology as well. So we always try to find every little angle and try and make it a story about a building or a project that makes everyone realize it's going to influence their lives in some way.
Iñigo, and what about your program? How much space and time you dedicate to that invisible part of architecture, which is not only talking in technical terms?
Yeah, I think it takes the big share of the story. I mean, that invisible part in radio, as I told before, I mean, you cannot give all the technical and all the details. So the story is the main line of that invisible part. For example, the social issues behind the one building. I remember, for example, like 3 examples of that. For example, when the Mies van der Rohe award to Lacaton and Vassal, the building in dwellings in Bordeaux, that was like a success. I managed to tell that news in our hard news program, because it was connected to housing issues, to the social housing issues in not only in Spain but in Europe. So that's a way to talk about architecture when you connect it to social issues that are on conversation. Then I remember, for example, I interviewed here in Madrid a few years ago because of an exhibition to Francis Queré, the architect from Burkina Faso. I mean, it was talking about his projects, his solidarity projects in his country. So that was another way to speak about architecture. And of course, this slot I dedicate to Spanish women in architecture. It's another way. You are talking, of course, about architecture, but you are talking about gender equality and the history of gender equality in Spain, when you show how a lot of women that have been important in the story of Spanish architecture.
Josep, Lluís?
Well, I'm really curious about the question because the invisible part of architecture, and my question should be, what is the visible part? And of course, we used to speak about technology, being technology, for example, because there are lots of engineers also, a part of architects who follows the program and so. Invisible, not visible. We used to define the architecture as a visual art, okay? And I think that this needs a very serious explanation as a complement. What kind of visuality are we talking about? Is the architecture defined by lines, volumes, or any other kind of visual boundary? And I think that the answer is clearly no. Architecture is mainly experience, and image may even distort the experience. At my beginnings, by talking about architecture through the radio waves, so it means without images, I saw that the answer was inside the problem itself. Or as one of the great mantras of the architecture says, difficulties are chances to make a better world. Yeah. So the absence of images may appear as a problem, but it's just the solution instead. And even when you try to talk about architecture from the radio, but referring to images, there are not images defined by perfect lines and volumes, because architecture is atmosphere, and the atmospheres are feelings and sensations, not lines nor volumes. If you want to watch at the architecture by the image, you might be watching with something like myopic, or like if you had been drinking a little bit more, but of alcohol that is socially accepted as right. It must be a non-focused watching. I think that when you feel yourself as you were trying to explain the architecture to blind people, then you are on the right way.
I couldn't agree more with you. I think that architecture is about the experience and also about the forces that shape the architecture as it is. And you said that you don't know what is the visible part of architecture. So it's the building itself. So this is what we see, but also there are lots of more experiences that we cannot see, but we should talk about them in order to understand. Because if we talk about only technologies, only the aesthetic appearance, then it's just statistics, and there is no need to make a radio program on that. I think that all of us, we are some kind of a critics of architecture, so in order to be critical, we should evaluate the impact of the architecture as well on people's life, on the city. And that's, for example, in my radio program, I also dedicate, I would say, more than half of time to this invisible part. And then we move to the curious question. Media loves scandals, or at least conflicts. Therefore, it's easier to talk about some problematic issues than to be happy about something that is just right. And I think that the story that Ivan told us at the beginning of this conversation is a perfect illustration. Mm-hmm. However, a positive message is also very needed in order to guide the audience towards the understanding of what is good contemporary architecture. How do you present those positive messages in order to avoid, to put it like a PR material? And we will start with Josep, please.
Well, sometimes conflicts leads you to the chance of talking about something, and this is the first idea. But anyway, when we start an interview, we used to face up not the problem but of the solutions. But this may vary from one subject to another one. Sometimes I find myself working more for students, for example. Sometimes the subject faces me to political questions. Sometimes when we talk about the architecture through the arts, then we stay in a contemplative attitude, or sometimes a change to know about the history for the simple pleasure to know about the history. There is a very extensive field of, of subjects. But if I had to talk about a common nexus in all of them, that is the idea of a collective intelligence. And this is what I tried to fit. Architecture is a professional sector defined by a strong sense of collective intelligence. Then, my idea, no matter what we're talking about, is ever sharing the knowledge. And when you share, everyone takes what he needs. So maybe you start a subject with a particular goal, but your intention is not important here because everyone used to hear what they want, not what the other says.
Andrew?
Well, I think sometimes controversy is positive. You know, if you look at the arguments and the debates and the fierce disagreements, sometimes that's a good thing to do. So, and if you look at a huge development like in New York, the Hudson Yards, which divided people, many people said, how dare this huge piece of land, a rare piece of land to be used for the city, to be used for tall towers and for corporate buildings. It should be more community-based. And there's still an argument about, you know, is it a good project, a bad project, and really divided people down the middle. And actually many architectural critics very opposed to it. But we jumped into that conversation because it's important for all of our cities. What kinds of projects do you want to rise on those rare bits of inner city land as they become available? So it's not always negative to be involved in that. And I think also some of the controversies around architecture are also important because at its best, architecture should be shaping society and feeding off the changes in society. So the shapes of families, the changing nature of work. You know, we're coming out, or we hope to be coming out of this pandemic. What's the legacy of that going to be on design and architecture? So all huge, important debates where people don't agree. And I think it's really positive to have that conversation out in the open. Not scandal, not, you know, what's happened between two architects or stolen money or anything like that. But the real controversy is about what do we want from the built environment? What do we want from architects? What do we deserve as people? And I think that we shouldn't shy away from that. We should dive into those conversations, and then the outcome will be positive. That will be a positive story.
Mm-hmm. Iñigo, if you had two ideas to present at your radio program, one controversial, another one positive, which one would you choose? And how do you work on presenting positive ideas?
I mean, I prefer to talk about positive things, but it's true that what Andrew said, that sometimes controversy, it's okay, and debate, because we are like, how we build our cities and how we live, and that's very interesting, something interesting, and it's something you can engage with the people. So just to try and manage to sell to the editors that story to be broadcasted. For example, here in Spain, there are sometimes a lot of debates about what to do with heritage, and for example, when architectural heritage, it's opposite to maybe new planning, and there's a controversy between the people who defend heritage and the people who defend like a new building or housing, for example. That would be a very controversial thing, and it's good to talk about. But for example, my tool to talk about positively about architecture is like, and my way is like curiosity. I mean, would say like brand new talking about architecture because I was very bad at the school, for example, with technical drawing, and but I'm passionate. I love it. So as long as I discover things about architecture and architects and projects, it's like, for me, it's like bringing the audience with me and say, look what's interesting, these stories, this architect made here, or and another way for talking positively about architecture, for example, it's when we talk about, for example, Spanish architects being or making projects abroad. It's quite interesting to show that, for example, the power of some Spanish architects in the world, and show them the projects they are doing inside Spain, but also abroad. It's another good tool to talk about positively about architecture.
I presume that you are not the only solo players at your radio program. You always have someone with you. What is the role and impact on the quality of the conversation of your guests? What criteria do you use when choosing who you would interview? I also think that they are not always only architects. And let's start with Iñigo.
For example, with this monthly slot I do for about Spanish women in architecture. For me, it's very important. My colleague, she's an architect. She's specialized in gender equality in architect. Her name is Lucía Pérez Moreno. She works for the University of Zaragoza. And for me, it's very important to have her with me to explain the work of those Spanish women in architecture. For me, the key is clarity. Again, I mean, people who's able to explain things plainly to the people, not being very technical, and if they sometimes use technical words, that they're able to explain them or in a few words, because I mean, again, time is limited in radio, so we have not time to make big researches of technical issues. But for me, clarity, people who's able to explain their work or the works of others, it's the key.
Andrew, in your podcast, we can see a very broad spectrum of the guests that you have for every show. And how do you choose them?
Well, again, sometimes making sure that it's not only the great architects that get to talk. So we did a show a little while ago about the environment and the city, and so we had people talking about making a greener city, a more environmentally aware city. But we went out with a guy who sweeps the roads. So we interviewed him. We went on his rounds with him as he was cleaning the streets, and we interviewed him about, okay, how does the public behave? Are they going to do all these new things that are being asked of them? How do you think you would have a cleaner city, a safer city for everybody to be in? Here's a guy who's on the street like 10 hours a day cleaning. And he was just as eloquent and clever about the built environment and how it works as sometimes when you talk to grander people. Just 2 weeks ago, we had the urbanist Jan Gale on. Now, we had him on because he's in his 80s. He's probably the most famous urbanist there is. But for him, the reason we wanted him on the show was because I think lots of people at the moment are giving you a very short-term view. Everyone's, the city will never be the same again. It's the end of co-working. It's the end of living together. We'll be in behind glass shields for the rest of our lives. Here's a guy who's 85 and who's seen it all before. And it was wonderful to speak to him and just see his confidence in human behavior, our desire to be together, what society is. So there we deliberately chose somebody who would just give you the really long perspective, because for our listeners as well, this idea of being negative, on the whole, we would like people to end the show feeling that they'd been introduced to somebody who could make their life better. They'd been given an opportunity to hear about a project that's a benchmark for improving things. We don't want to leave people at the end of the show with their heads in their hand and crying. We want people to say, okay, that's good. I can think about that for me. I could do that in my neighborhood. I could campaign for that. And that's what Jan Gale did. He left people thinking, this is tough, it will pass, and we must make decisions about our built environment and our architecture that are long-term, not just driven by the last 12 weeks.
Josep, Lluís, please add your 5 cents and then we move to the questions of the public.
Sorry, it's the same question, okay?
Yes,
yeah,
the
okay.
same question about the guests.
Yeah. Well, I love to interview important architects, of course, but sometimes you feel that the most important of a project, it can be explained by a young architect. It's because for generational questions, we already have millennial architects, yeah, and then you can you can find the difference of about everything that a generation is given. Sometimes I notice that some projects explained by the main architect differs a lot, and with the explanations of a young architect, and I like to bring both visions when it's possible. But another thing I try is to show the ideas from the citizens itself, because every day is usual, more usual, the participation of people in the projects, and they really have the vision of what they need, and I try to give them the possibility of speak and explain what they really need. Well, my idea is to bring some balance of about different opinions. But what I don't like to bring to the program is politicals, simply because here in Catalunya Ràdio, politicals have a great space. The 80% of the space is for politicals. So I try either to bring only architects or artists or designers, but I try to avoid the political opinions.
Well, I would like to continue on this, but we should move to the public questions as we have some 10 minutes left. So I will forward the questions and then we will try to answer. We've got some 20, probably it's too optimistic to try to respond to all of them. Well, the first one is, due to the increasing urbanization, architecture has begun to be linked to current challenges such as the climate emergency or social inequalities. Has this contributed to increasing general interest in architecture? Who wants to answer? Can I offer Andrew the floor?
Definitely. I think people feel that they have a right to be part of this conversation, and the environment is going to be ever more important. And I would say that actually, I think architects are doing very well at moving fast on a lot of these challenges. In many countries, you see very early adoption of all the demands about environment needs and change. Lots of architectural organizations in different countries have moved very fast to be leaders in the field. But people want to know that not just the building is going to have a LEED certification or to be a little bit greener than the buildings before. They want to know what it does for community as well. So it's not, again, just one of these single silos of information. They would like to know, do ordinary people get to live in there? Is the housing going to be affordable? Are the materials that are going to be used long lasting? So I think there's a lot of debates going on, and they're all really fascinating. And they're also really complicated because it's great that the public gets to have their say about projects, and participatory architecture is good. But then, in fairness, when you often speak to architects at the end of that process, they're going slightly crazy because that they have to make a decision in the end, and they have to make a building, and they have to complete a project. So sometimes their knowledge gets a little bit kind of lost. But yeah, I think yes, it's super important. It should be important, and I think the conversation is moving in the right direction in most cities.
I would add also that this is a perfect chance for the architects to raise the awareness of the importance of architecture and their profession, because many people don't understand the role of an architect and the role of architecture in their lives and in the future of our planet as well. Would you agree, Iñigo?
Yeah, of course, absolutely. Because I mean, this type of issues, climate change and social issues, as we told before, or even the crisis we are living now, it helps and linked to architecture. That provokes that architecture is more on in the media, in radio. I mean, it's easier for me, for example, to to get into the hard news programs, for example, with an architecture news, if it's linked to this type of issues. For example, this morning I have broadcasted a 1-minute story about the editorial that David Chipperfield has written in Domus review about shelter, about home. So it's a good way to speak about architecture when you linked it to these urgent issues, of course.
Josep, Lluís, do you want to add something?
Yes, of course. The current problems are just what interest to the people. Let's say the climate change, but let's say this pandemic that we are living right now. So I think it's very important to bring a voice to the architects because they don't used to appear on the medias talking about solutions. We used to watch doctors, but not architects. And I think it's very important because this crisis puts on the table the problem of our houses. How is this space distributed? How do we live? Because we don't used to spend a long time at home, but now it's just the opposite, and all these problems emerge to the reality, and it's obvious that a new kind of design is needed and urgently needed. It has to come very quickly. And also the same in hospitals. Architects are very important in designing the spaces inside hospitals, and they are actually making a very hard work, and in a very short time to adapt these structures to the new realities, and I think that just at the moment it's right that we have to explain right now.
The next question is related with the disadvantage of not having the image on the radio program, which can turn out into the advantage. Describing architecture and cities through words rather than images might lead to a focus away from iconic architecture and rather look at societal or ecological impact and user-centric outlook. Iñigo, would you agree?
Yeah, of course, I agree, and it gives the opportunity maybe to move from the debate of a building, it's beautiful or it's ugly, which is a lot of times the debate around architecture. So not having to show it and opening the debate if it's ugly or it's beautiful, that building. I think that's at the end is an advantage because you open the ways you can use to talk about architecture rather than only just focusing on the image you have of that building, of that public space.
My answer would be also positive because, as I said, we have to talk not only about how architecture is made, but why it is as it is. What are the forces and what are the stories behind the architecture? And those stories are mostly, they should be related with the improvement of a social sphere of a city. Andrew.
Yeah, and I think that's the other interesting thing for all of us who are doing radio shows is that there is a world of the so-called starchitect that actually gets covered very well. If you're worrying about a new museum in Abu Dhabi, there'll be plenty of coverage of that in all sorts of newspapers and all sorts of magazines. And it's our job as journalists, I think, to, without being obscure, is not to always look at the obvious story and to look at the people, one row across from that front tier of architects, who else is doing interesting work. And it was really interesting you talking about David Chipperfield, because he's a perfect example of an amazing architect who's not just thinking about the buildings he's putting up. He's concerned about society. I know he does some work in Galicia about reviving villages, and bringing jobs back, and what could be the role of forestry and of the village. Now that's the kind of thinking that is amazing and excites people. I think everyone's got a little bit bored with these grand gestures of buildings, which, again, what's the end use? Is it a power play by a state? Is it really about ordinary people? So yeah, anything that moves the conversation away just from the same 10 names every time, doing interesting work, important people, but everybody else can cover that. Let us do the job of finding the other stories that people don't get to hear.
I'll try to share some questions among themselves in order to keep it shorter. So the next one goes for Josep Lluís. McLuhan made a hot and cool distinction between the sensory effects of media. Radio is hot. Do you think radio can really help to make architecture issues familiar to the audience more than TV?
Well, I think that there is a link between what you heard, but I think that it's general about the radio itself, because when you are on TV, you are really a slave of the screen, okay? And when you have the radio, I think it is related with what we were talking about some minutes before. When you have the image, you're a slave or something of lines and volumes, and talking about through the radio lets you to imagine, and I think it's a very great difference. I think it's not the same in any way.
Well, we're just getting warming up, but I've got a message from the organizers that it's time for a wrap up. I'm sorry to say that, my friends, but unfortunately, we have to finish our conversation. Thank you very much. I know that we've got lots of questions from the audience, so I think that it will leave us with the inspiration to think about the answers to those questions and to improve our job for the next podcast and radio programs. And I would like to end up this conversation with a thought by Josep Lluís, who said that we don't have to talk about the buildings on the radio. We have to explain architecture as a philosophical position and a way of thinking. I think that there could not be a better explanation of how to talk about architecture on the radio. Thank you, all of you. Thanks to the audience.
Thank you.
Let's stay tuned. Ivan.
Thank you very much, Rūta. Yesterday, speaking with Ducho Malagamba, who's an architect and a photographer who will be joining us in the morning session, he was saying, "Why is it that short? Can it be longer, or why are you limited?" We think it has to have the time it has, and I guess with podcasts you could also go on forever, or with radio programs, but there are limits. And it is true that we have enjoyed the conversation very much. I want to thank you, Josep Lluís, Blázquez, Iñigo Picabea, Rūta, Leitanaitė as well, and Andrew Tuck. And speaking about Andrew, and when you were speaking about Jangel, I think it is very interesting what you said, that it is important that we end the show with this feeling that we have had the opportunity to improve something, optimistic, so that we hope that we all leave with a good impression, that we can now continue thinking about many important, interesting things that you have brought up, and even campaign for something. And tomorrow we continue, it's the last day, so we have a double session in the morning at 11 o'clock. It's a workshop where you're also all invited via YouTube at 11 in the morning with Enric, lawyer. It's called Copyright in Architectural Images. And we will also count with Elena Ugas from the Catalan Association of Architects. She's also a lawyer. Photographers Ducho Malagamba and Adrià Goula. And also Alejandra Liébana, in charge of communication in Valle Roig, an architecture office here in Barcelona. And Martin Boschart from World Architects, the marketing director. And then in the afternoon at 5 o'clock, we will have the closing conversation with Ivan Ban, photographer from the Netherlands, in conversation with Eva Porewska, editor from Warsaw. And they will be speaking about the role of images in telling the story of an architectural work. So we hope that you have enjoyed it as much as we have, and we meet you tomorrow again on YouTube. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.